Hi, I'm Elaine. When I asked my stepmother what time my father's funeral would be, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "Oh, he's been gone for a while. We buried him already, just close friends." No call, no invite. They let him die and buried him like he never had a daughter. But a week later, she called me, her voice shaking. "What the hell are you doing to my life?" What was I doing? Reclaiming a name, exposing everything they tried to erase, and standing at his grave, not to cry, but to say, "I'm still here." Before we dive in, what would you have done in my place? Drop a comment below. I read every one. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I'd just come in from a long day at the college, my heels kicked off by the door, my canvas bag sagging with ungraded papers. The sun had already slipped beneath the Pacific horizon, casting my living room in shadows. I dropped my keys into the ceramic dish by the door, the clink louder than it should have been. I reheated leftover risotto, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat cross-legged on the couch, absent-mindedly thumbing through my phone. Emails. Faculty group chat drama. Spam. One voicemail stood out, short, with no transcription. Oregon area code. I pressed play, expecting an update from the bookstore I'd ordered from. "Elaine, this is Clarice. Just letting you know, your father passed last week. We've already had a small funeral. No need to fly out." Click. That was it. No hello. No, I'm sorry. Just logistics. Like she was informing me the trash collection day had changed. I didn't move. Not for minutes. Maybe longer. The risotto went cold. The wine sat untouched. I just stared at the wall, blinking. My phone slipped from my hand and thudded against the rug. I picked it up again, dialed her number. Straight to voicemail. Tried again. Nothing. I scrolled through old messages. There weren't many. Most were from my students. One from my dad popped up, dated 6 months ago. "Happy birthday, kiddo. Hope you're well." I hadn't replied. I set the phone down, stood up, and immediately felt dizzy. The air was too still. I opened the window, letting the cool ocean breeze rush in. My breath hitched, not from the cold, but from everything pressing down on me. Grief didn't show up the way I expected. No sobs, no collapsing to the floor. Just silence. And something deep in my chest that felt like a stone sinking slowly, too heavy to cry over yet. I tried Clarice again. Still nothing. Eventually, I pulled a blanket over my shoulders and walked to my bookshelf. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Comfort? Distraction? My eyes landed on a book my dad gave me when I was 12, The Old Man and the Sea. He'd underlined passages in pencil. Back then, I didn't understand why. Now I wondered if he saw himself in that old fisherman. Stubborn, isolated, misunderstood. I opened it, half expecting a hidden note to fall out. Nothing. Just the faint smell of aged paper and a pencil mark on page 94. A man can be destroyed, but not defeated. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, waiting for dawn to make it real. By morning, I knew I needed answers. I didn't want to talk to Clarice again, not until I could stop myself from yelling. Instead, I called Aunt Meredith, Dad's older sister. She picked up on the second ring. "Elaine?" Her voice cracked. "Oh my God. Are you okay?" "I just found out," I said. "Clarice left me a voicemail." "You weren't at the funeral?" she asked, horrified. "She told me there was no need to come." There was a pause, long and shaking. "She said you didn't want to, that you blamed him. She said you refused." My hands balled into fists on the kitchen counter. "That's a lie." "I know," Meredith whispered. "God, I'm so sorry, honey." We all thought you chose to stay away." I swallowed hard. "I'm coming. I'm flying out tonight." "Do you want me to pick you up from the airport?" "No," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll rent a car. I need to see his place. I need to see where he—" My throat caught. I didn't finish the sentence. "I'll be here when you're ready," Meredith said gently. "You're not alone, sweetheart." After we hung up, I showered, packed a bag, and stared at the small wooden box that had sat on the top shelf of my closet for years. It was old and chipped, something Dad had given me on my 18th birthday. I'd never opened it. I brought it down, my hands trembling slightly. Inside was a folded letter on thick stationery, the kind he used back when he still wrote things by hand. "Yvain, you'll always be my compass, even when I don't show it right. I know I failed in some ways, but I hope one day you'll see I was trying. Love you, always. Dad." No grand apology, no explanation. Just that. And yet it hit harder than anything. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of my coat. The sun had just begun to set again as I zipped my bag. Outside, the world went on, cars passing, dogs barking, children laughing on scooters. None of them knew that my world had just cracked open in a way I hadn't expected. At the airport, everything moved in slow motion. Security lines, gate changes, the dull hum of overhead announcements. I sat by the window, watching planes disappear into the clouds, wondering if I'd ever really known my father at all. Or if Clarice had managed to erase me from his life while I wasn't paying attention. As I boarded the plane, the question that refused to leave my mind played over and over like a broken record. Why didn't he wait for me? The flight touched down in Portland just past midnight. I didn't bother checking into a hotel. I'd booked a rental car, threw my duffel in the back, and drove the quiet streets straight to the house I once called home. The sun was barely rising when I pulled up in front of the bungalow. I hadn't been back in years, but somehow it felt smaller. Trim lawn, the same hanging flower basket by the porch. Too neat, too curated, like someone had tried too hard to make it look lived in. The front door opened before I even knocked. Clarice. Her expression didn't change when she saw me. If anything, her face tightened. "I didn't expect you'd come all this way," she said, voice cool as ever. "The service is already over." I gave a tight nod. So I heard. She didn't move aside, didn't offer a hug or even a, "How are you?" Just stood there, hands on the frame like she wanted to block the doorway. After a beat, she finally stepped back. "You can stay in your old room. It's still got your bed in it. I haven't touched much." I walked in. The smell hit me first. Lemon cleaner and artificial lavender. The kind used to mask something older, something forgotten. The place felt staged, sterile. "Coffee?" she asked, already turning toward the kitchen. "No thanks, I won't be long." She looked over her shoulder. "You flew across the country just to leave again?" "I came to say goodbye." "To someone already gone?" I stared at her, unblinking. "To my father." She didn't respond, just turned back to the sink and ran water over an already clean mug. After a moment of silence, I said, "You said it was a small service. Do you have any photos? A program?" Clarice didn't turn around. There wasn't much to photograph. No paper trail. That's how he wanted it. No obituary? She shrugged. No point. Everyone who mattered was there. My jaw tightened. I checked the local listings. There's nothing. Not even a mention. "Like I said," she muttered, rinsing the mug again for no reason. "He didn't want any fuss." I studied her back. She was lying. I could feel it in my bones. "I'd like to visit the cemetery." "Suit yourself. Plot 9A at Hillside Memorial. Far left row. There's nothing fancy, just grass. That much, I believed. I grabbed my coat and left without another word. The cemetery was quiet when I arrived, the morning fog still clinging to the grass. A man in coveralls and a faded cap waved at me from the maintenance shed. "You looking for someone?" "I was told my father was buried here. William Hastings, supposed to be Plot 9A. The man scratched his chin, brow furrowing. Yeah. Thursday morning, if I remember right. Woman came with a guy in a suit. Looked like some kind of notary. Odd combo for a funeral." "Were you there?" He nodded. I helped lower the casket. No prayers, no guests. Just them two. "Real quick." He led me to the far left row, down a gravel path littered with pine needles. We stopped in front of a bare patch of grass. No headstone, no name, no flowers, nothing. "This it?" I asked quietly. "That's the one," he said. "Temporary marker got pulled by the wind. Happens sometimes. I can make sure it gets replaced." I knelt beside the disturbed earth, brushing aside a few fallen leaves. "Thanks," I murmured, though my voice sounded far away. The man waited a respectful distance before walking off, whistling softly. I sat there a while, trying to feel something, anything, but the cold emptiness in my chest only grew deeper. My father was buried here, and no one would have known. If I hadn't come, there would have been no trace at all. I drove aimlessly after that, through the old part of town, past the hardware store where Dad used to buy tool sets he didn't need, past the diner he took me to for pancakes when I was little. Then I found myself pulling up outside St. Andrew's Chapel. Dad hadn't been a devout churchgoer, but he'd occasionally attended services here after Mom passed. I stepped inside, the smell of old wood and candle wax greeting me like a whisper. A man in clerical garb appeared from a side door. "Can I help you?" I introduced myself. "My name is Elaine Hastings. My father used to come here sometimes. William Hastings." His face softened. Yes. I remember William. I'm Reverend Henry. I just found out he passed. I wasn't told about the funeral." He gave a gentle nod, folding his hands. "I'm sorry to hear that. I wondered why you weren't there." "Clarice told people I chose not to come." His lips pressed into a line. "That's unfortunate." "Did he leave anything with the church?" I asked. "He used to write things down, letters." The Reverend hesitated. "Actually, he did ask us to hold something for you. A letter. Said it was personal." I felt my breath catch. "Can I see it?" He looked apologetic. "I'm afraid it was never picked up. I gave it to her last week, assuming she'd pass it along." "Of course." "She didn't," I said flatly. The Reverend's face tightened. "I'm sorry. It wasn't my place to interfere." "No, it's not your fault." We talked a little longer, about my dad's quiet nature, the way he used to sit in the back pew, always alone. When I left, the Reverend put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Sometimes grief brings out the worst in people, but truth has a way of making itself known." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Back at the house, Clarice was in the kitchen again, chopping celery with the precision of a surgeon. She barely looked up as I passed her. I didn't stop to engage. Instead, I made my way to the garage. It hadn't changed much. The same old pegboard lined with mismatched tools, the same creaky stool. I opened drawers, flipped through dusty boxes. It took nearly an hour before I found it, hidden behind an old tackle box, a small metal tin. On the lid, in my father's handwriting, were the words, "For why?" My hands shook as I pried it open. Inside was a photo, me, Dad, and Mom, torn in half. Clarissa's face was nowhere in sight. A flash drive, unlabeled, and a pocket watch. still ticking. I held it in my palm, the same one he used to wind at the dinner table when conversation got awkward, the same one I'd played with as a kid, listening to the soft, rhythmic tick. I closed the box and slipped it into my bag. As I stepped back into the house, Clarice didn't say a word. The smell of sautéing onions hung thick in the air. The house felt too warm, too silent. I walked past her, back to my old room. That night, I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, fingers wrapped around the flash drive, staring at it like it might start glowing. What was she so desperate to keep buried? And that night, as Clarice cooked in silence, I sat in my old room, staring at the flash drive, wondering, what was she so desperate to keep buried? The room still smelled faintly of old rosewood and mothballs. The same floral wallpaper my dad had once let me pick out still clung to the walls, faded and peeling near the corners. My childhood bookshelf was still there too, books slightly off-kilter like no one had touched them in years. I plugged the flash drive into my old laptop, heart thudding as if it already knew what was coming. Just one file appeared. For Yvain, if I don't get to say goodbye. My hand hesitated over the trackpad. I clicked, and there he was. My father, thinner, paler, sitting in the old study chair in front of his desk. His eyes looked tired but clear, focused. His voice cracked as he began, "If you're watching this, then I didn't get to tell you myself." I swallowed hard. The lump in my throat pushed upward. His voice was different, gentler than I remembered. Not the clipped tone he used during family dinners. This felt private. "I'm sorry, baby girl. I wanted more time, more chances, but I ran out of both." He looked down for a second, wiping his face. "I made a mess of things. I thought I was protecting you by keeping you away from certain truths. But maybe I just didn't want to admit what was right in front of me." He sighed. "I let Clarice come between us. I thought she was helping. She was always good with words, always knew how to make herself sound like the voice of reason. But I should have questioned more. I should have listened to you." He paused again, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Clarice isn't who she says she is. I found something, Yvain, something about the house, the accounts. I was going to fix it." My fingers curled tightly around the edges of the laptop. "Don't trust what she shows you. Check the basement wall. Behind the old wine rack." Then he smiled faintly, just a flicker of the man I used to adore. "You were always the strongest one, Yvain. I knew you'd find your way back." The video ended, and I sat there, silent, with tears on my face I didn't remember shedding. I stayed like that for a while, staring at the black screen, my father's last words echoing in my head. The weight of everything he hadn't said when he was alive now crashed into me all at once. He had tried to reach me. He had tried to undo what she'd done. I wasn't crazy for suspecting Clarice. I wasn't wrong. Suddenly, a different kind of grief washed over me. Not just the loss of my father, but the loss of what could have been. We might have reconciled, if Clarice hadn't stood between us. I remembered the last time I tried to visit him, 3 years ago. I'd flown in on a whim, just wanted to surprise him. Clarice met me at the door with a strained smile. "Oh, Yvain, he's not home, sweetie." "He left for a conference this morning. Didn't I text you?" No, she hadn't. She knew I was coming. She looked me in the eye and lied. And like a fool, I left. Told myself maybe she was right, maybe the timing was bad. But it wasn't about bad timing. It was about control. She'd kept me away, deliberately, repeatedly. My eyes shifted toward the clock on the nightstand. 12:47 a.m. The house was silent. Clarice had gone to bed after cleaning up her untouched meal. I heard the TV flick off around midnight, followed by the soft creak of her door. Now was the time. I slipped out of my room, careful not to let the old floorboards betray me. The basement door was just past the pantry, where the light flickered like it always had. I grabbed a flashlight from the shelf and eased the basement door open. It groaned, loudly. I paused. No sounds from upstairs. Each step down the basement stairs felt heavier than the last. I hadn't been down here since college. The air was colder, still carrying that damp earth smell that clung to everything. The wine rack was exactly where I remembered. Built into the brick wall, cheap pine and badly varnished, but I wasn't looking for Merlot. I crouched down, running my fingers along the back of the rack. A small crack in the panel caught the beam of my flashlight. I pressed it. Click. The panel gave way with a soft push. Behind it, a narrow cavity, maybe 2 feet wide. Inside, a small fireproof box. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled it out. It was heavier than I expected. I turned it in my hands. No lock, just a latch. I opened it. Inside were several neatly stacked envelopes. The first one read, Citizens Trust Ledger, Account Summary. Underneath, a bundle of checks, all signed by my father, each made out in Clarissa's name. Thousands, tens of thousands, dated over the past decade. And then, at the bottom of the box, a legal folder. The tab read, Last Will Testament, Revised. I flipped it open. My eyes darted down the first page. It was dated just 2 months before he died. And my name was everywhere. He'd named me sole heir, executor, full authority, everything. Not Clarice, not split, not shared, just me. I stood there, in that dark basement, the flashlight clutched between my teeth, my hands shaking, the will open in front of me. My knees went weak, but I didn't fall. He'd known. He'd seen through her in the end, and he'd tried to make it right. But she hadn't just buried my father's body. She'd buried the truth with it. And as I held the will in my shaking hands, one thing became painfully clear. Clarice had buried more than just my father. I sat at the kitchen table long after sunrise, the house still cloaked in silence. A cold cup of tea sat untouched by my elbow, forgotten. The will lay open in front of me, every word seared into memory now. My eyes drifted down again, just to be sure. Notarized, sealed, appointing one Mr. Roland Eckhart as executor. A name I hadn't heard in years. I grabbed my phone and searched the contact list. Nothing, of course. But a quick online search brought him up, still practicing, still listed at the same address downtown. My fingers hovered above the screen for a moment, then pressed call. 2 rings, then a third. Mr. Eckhart's office. This is... Hi, I'm looking for Mr. Roland Eckhart. It's about Peter St. James's estate. A pause. Then a soft, measured voice took over. This is Roland. May I ask who's calling? I hesitated, not expecting him to answer directly. My name is Yvain. Peter St. James was my father. There was a sharp inhale on the other end. You're Yvain? His voice cracked. Good Lord, I've been trying to find you for weeks. That stopped me. Weeks? Yes. I thought... Clarice told me you refused contact. Said you didn't want anything to do with the estate. I didn't want to pressure you during your grief, but I found it strange. Of course she did. She never told me he passed, I said flatly. I found out yesterday. There was silence on the line. I see, he said finally. Would you be willing to come in today? There's a great deal we should talk about. I was already grabbing my keys. His office sat in a modest brick building just off the square. I parked behind a dusty sedan and walked in, the bell above the door giving a half-hearted jingle. Mr. Eckhart was older than I remembered, thinner, with gray tufts curling behind his ears and a kind weariness in his eyes. He rose when he saw me. You look like him, he said softly. Same eyes. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He motioned for me to sit, then pulled a thick folder from the cabinet behind him. Your father updated his will not long after his diagnosis returned. Stage 4. He told me he didn't want to leave anything open for interpretation, as he put it. I folded my hands on my lap. And what did it say? He opened the folder and read aloud. To my daughter, Yvain St. James, I leave the entirety of my estate, including, but not limited to, the primary residence, the lake cabin, the vintage Pontiac, and all remaining financial assets. I sat perfectly still. And the will reading? When was it? He looked down at his calendar notes. It was scheduled 3 weeks after his passing. Clarice showed up early that morning and said you'd refuse to attend. She canceled the reading, citing emotional distress and lack of interest from the heir. I let out a long, slow breath. And you believed her? She had legal documents, a temporary power of attorney from months prior. It wasn't unreasonable at the time, but I didn't know she hadn't contacted you. Had I known, you would have done nothing, I said quietly. Just like everyone else. He bowed his head. Maybe so. I stood. I need a certified copy of that will. Today. He handed it over without question. And one more thing, I added. Is there a copy of the previous will on file? Yes, he said. It named both you and Clarice as equal beneficiaries. I nodded. That explains the motive. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was almost 6. The sky was fading into a burnt orange, and the porch lights were starting to hum. I entered through the back, passing by the faint scent of something roasted in the oven. Clarice was setting the table, 2 bowls of stew, a loaf of bread, wine already poured. She looked up and offered a strained smile. You were out late. Had some errands. I sat down across from her, my fingers tight around the base of my glass. We ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds coming from clinking cutlery and the occasional creak of an old floorboard upstairs. Then I said it. Why didn't you tell me Dad passed? She froze mid-sip. Her spoon clinked loudly against the side of her bowl. I figured you wouldn't care. I stared at her, letting the silence hang in the air like fog. I saw the will. Her face didn't change, but her eyes flicked down just for a split second, like a signal she wasn't ready to give. Still, I didn't press. Not yet. I just let the weight of those words settle between us, unspoken truths pushing the air out of the room. I stood, carried my plate to the sink, and left her sitting there with a bowl of stew growing cold. Later that night, I was digging through the drawers in the upstairs hallway, looking for an old tax document my father used to keep, when I stumbled across my old phone. I hadn't seen it in years. It was tucked beneath some yellowed receipts and a broken pair of glasses. I plugged it in, watched the screen flicker to life, then waited as it charged. 40%. Just enough. I scrolled through the saved voicemails. Most were junk, spam, or forgotten messages from college, but one, time-stamped just 6 weeks before his death, had a subject line, Dad. I pressed play. Hey, kiddo. If anything happens, just know I love you. I should have said it more. I was proud of you, even when I didn't show it. I didn't know how to fix everything. There was a long pause. Then his voice came back, quieter. And be careful. Clarice isn't grieving. She's planning. I sat perfectly still, that tiny recording playing over and over, letting each word root deeper. Then I forwarded it to myself, to my laptop, and saved it 3 separate times. Once in the cloud, once on a flash drive, once in a hidden folder titled Recipes. I wasn't going to let her erase this too. By morning, I was parked outside the courthouse, will in hand, and a copy of Dad's voicemail saved in 3 different places. By the time the hearing date arrived, the sky had turned that heavy gray that only late autumn could paint. 1 week had passed since I sat in Mr. Eckhart's office, the voicemail fresh in my ears, the truth sharper than any knife Clarice had ever wielded. That morning, I buttoned up my navy blazer with calm hands. Not nervous, focused, determined. Every file was neatly clipped in my bag: the will, the notarized affidavit, a printout of the email my father had sent confirming the update, and of course, the voicemail, backed up 3 different ways. I met Mr. Eckhart at the courthouse steps just before 9 a.m. He gave me a small nod, holding a briefcase that looked older than me. "You ready?" "As I'll ever be." Inside the probate courtroom, the lighting was unforgiving, fluorescent, cold, humming like a distant warning. I spotted Clarice immediately. She wore black again, a tasteful veil draped halfway down her face. Widowcore, if you asked social media. But to me, it looked like performance. She didn't acknowledge me. The clerk called the case number, and we all rose. Judge Hernandez stepped up to the bench, stern-faced but alert. He adjusted his glasses and scanned the docket. "Proceeding regarding the estate of Peter St. James. Appearing today are Ms. Elaine Rowan, daughter and named heir of the deceased, and Mrs. Clarice Rowan, spouse of the deceased." Mr. Eckhart cleared his throat and stood. "Your Honor, we are submitting into record a revised and notarized will, dated 7 months prior to Mr. St. James's death, naming Ms. Elaine Rowan as sole beneficiary. Additionally, we have reason to believe the original will was intentionally suppressed by the respondent." Clarice didn't blink. She simply folded her hands. Judge Hernandez looked over the document, nodding slowly. "This revision supersedes the previously submitted will?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And was this information made known to the court by the decedent's family?" "That's the issue," Mr. Eckhart said, gesturing calmly. "The respondent claimed the heir was estranged and uninterested in any estate matters. We believe that's not only false, it was a deliberate attempt to mislead the court." Clarice finally rose. Her voice was soft, laced with practiced sadness. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my stepdaughter and my husband hadn't spoken in years. There was tension. She left. She didn't return even when he became ill. He was heartbroken." The judge turned toward me. "Ms. Rowan, would you like to respond?" I stood slowly, careful not to rush it. I pulled the flash drive from my blazer pocket and handed it to the bailiff. "Yes, Your Honor. My father and I spoke regularly. He confided in me. What Mrs. Rowan said is simply not true." I looked at Clarice, but she avoided my eyes. The bailiff loaded the file, and my father's voice filled the courtroom. "Just know I love you. I should have said it more. I was proud of you." Even with years of distance, the room was suddenly heavy with something real. Clarice isn't grieving, she's planning. When the recording ended, there wasn't a sound in the room. Even the judge took a moment before speaking. "I'd like to review this in chambers," he said finally, and excused himself with the evidence. The 10 minutes he was gone felt longer than the last year of my life. Clarice didn't move, neither did I. When Judge Hernandez returned, he didn't sit immediately. He looked at both of us. Based on the documents submitted, the notarized revisions, and the clear voice of the deceased, I find that Mr. Peter St. James fully intended for his daughter, Ms. Elaine Rowan, to inherit his estate in its entirety. Clarice shifted, just slightly. The judge continued. "All claims by Mrs. Clarice Rowan are hereby nullified. Furthermore, this court finds grounds to refer this matter for further review under potential fraud statutes regarding the concealment of the will." Clarice gasped, not loudly, but enough for me to see the mask slip. Court adjourned. Outside the courthouse, the wind cut a little sharper than earlier. I tightened my coat as I stepped into the open, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle over me. Clarice stormed down the steps behind me, heels clacking like gunshots. "You've ruined everything," she hissed. I didn't flinch. "No." You did that when you buried more than a man. You buried a legacy." She stopped short, eyes wide and glassy. For once, she had no clever reply, just silence, and the sound of her footsteps echoing down the sidewalk as she disappeared. That evening, I drove alone. No music, just the low rumble of the tires on pavement. The cemetery sat quiet beneath a veil of early fog. The grass had gone yellow, brittle underfoot. I walked to the grave with a small pot of marigolds in one hand and a polished stone in the other. I knelt and cleared the dried leaves from the base of the headstone. I hadn't brought anything grand, just a small engraved marker with his name and the phrase, "He made peace." I pressed it gently into the soil, then sat beside it for a while. "Dad," I whispered, "it's done." There was no breeze, no dramatic sign, just stillness, and that was enough. But even with the house in my name, the accounts restored, and the lies exposed, I wasn't done. Not yet. 3 days after the ruling, I stood in the entryway of the home I'd grown up in. It looked the same, smelled the same. Wood polish, old plaster, something faintly floral that never quite left the air. But this time it was mine. And something about that made everything sharper, like I could finally see the bones of the place. I walked through each room slowly, not like I was inspecting, but like I was remembering. This wasn't nostalgia. It was a quiet audit. Which walls had heard my father's laughter? Which corners Clarice had claimed over the years and turned sterile? Upstairs, I paused at the attic door. That latch had been stiff since I was a teenager, but with a solid pull and a groan of wood, it gave way. Dust bloomed in the light as I climbed the narrow stairs. The attic was more organized than I remembered. Along the far wall, several boxes sat stacked in neat columns, each labeled in careful handwriting. Rowan Holdings, 1947 to 1989. Some labels bore my grandfather's name. Others, my father's. I opened the first one with trembling fingers. Inside, ledgers, maps, rolled deeds, and a smaller box with a leather-bound journal on top. My father's name was embossed on the corner. I sat down on the old floorboards, brushed the dust from the cover, and began to read. Clarice keeps asking about the old trust my father left behind. She thinks I don't know her game. But I'm not blind. I swallowed. Page after page, my father's voice came alive in ink. Notes about business decisions, personal regrets, things he thought but never said aloud. In one entry dated nearly a year before his death, he wrote, "If anything happens, Elaine needs to find the keys, both sets. Without them, she can't access the backup accounts. She has to look in the book. She'll remember." The book. I closed the journal and sat in silence, the wood creaking under me as I thought. Then it clicked. In his study, he always kept a worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea on the third shelf, left side. No one ever touched it. I went downstairs, the steps feeling more familiar with each one. In the study, sunlight cut through the blinds like gold thread. I found the Hemingway book exactly where it had always been. I lifted it. Heavy. The pages were glued together, hollowed out in the center. Inside, 2 key rings, one brass, one silver. The tags were simple. Lake House Vault. Garage Box A. The garage. Clarice had always kept the back garage locked. I'd asked once, years ago, and she said, "It's just junk. Old tools, probably mice." But the way she said it had always stuck with me, too casual. I threw on my jacket and stepped outside. The air had shifted, autumn biting a little harder. Leaves crunched under my boots as I crossed the gravel toward the back structure. The padlock was still there. I slid in the silver key. It turned. The door groaned open. Inside was dim, but not empty. No mice, no tools. A single fireproof chest sat in the center of the space, flanked by 2 shelves of old file boxes. I stepped closer, heart thudding. In the chest, more ledgers. A sealed envelope marked Bank of Cattail, Deposit Box 34. And at the bottom, a deed. It was signed by my grandfather. Property in his name. Not my father's, not Clarice's. Mine. At least, it had been. I stared at the signature. The date, 1986. That was the year I was born. It was titled to a trust in my name, one I'd never heard about. I needed answers. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. The building hadn't changed in decades. Peeling paint, glass doors that stuck, the quiet hum of forgotten government. A woman behind the desk looked up as I approached. "Help you?" "Yes, I'm trying to trace property records for a parcel I just discovered." It belonged to my grandfather's trust, dated back to the late 80s. She blinked, then motioned to a seat. "Give me the deed." I slid it across. She typed slowly, fingers deliberate. "Haven't seen a Rowan trust come through here in years." Her words faded as she squinted at the screen, then frowned. "What is it?" I asked. "There's a note in the digital ledger. This property was part of the Rowan Trust until 2021. Then the title was changed, owner reassignment." But what?" She turned the monitor slightly. "That reassignment doesn't list a beneficiary, just a name. Clarice Rowan." I stared at the screen. "She removed me from the trust," I whispered. The woman raised an eyebrow. "You were the original beneficiary?" "Yes." "Then someone's got explaining to do. That's not just an update. That's a legal reroute. Could be forgery, depending on how it was done." I asked for copies, paid extra to have them certified. Drove home without music again, just the sound of tires on road, my thoughts louder than the engine. At the kitchen table, I laid everything out. The keys, the journal, the deed, the digital printouts. It wasn't just theft. Clarice hadn't just stolen from my present. She'd tried to erase me from the past, rewrite my family's future like I had never mattered. And now, finally, I had proof. I now held proof of something far bigger than inheritance theft. Clarice had reached into the past to rewrite my family's future. And now, I had to see what she tried so hard to bury. 2 mornings later, I found myself behind the wheel, driving up the winding coastal road toward Elder's Bluff. The deed in my purse pointed to a location I barely remembered, something my father once mentioned in passing when I was a teenager, calling it the quiet place where real things lived. I never asked what he meant. The cliffs were steeper than I expected, raw, beautiful in that kind of way that made you sit back and second-guess whether humans should build anything near it. But sure enough, just past mile marker 72, I spotted a rusted iron gate tucked between a break in the stone wall. Ivy had started to take over, but the name was still there. Rowan Bluff. Est. 1947. I stepped out and reached into my coat for the old key. Brass, worn smooth at the edges. It fit like it belonged. And the gate creaked open on hinges stiff with sea salt. Past it was a gravel drive that curved between thickets of wind-bent pine and wild blackberries. I followed it slowly, each turn revealing more of a property hidden away from the world. And then I saw it. The cottage stood humbly on the cliff's edge, slate roof, faded white walls, with a small greenhouse to the left and a detached shed out back. The windows weren't broken, but they were dusty, the kind of dusty that told you no one had cleaned them in a while. I parked and got out. The silence was thick. No birds, no wind, just ocean roaring below. Then a voice called out, rough but not unfriendly. "You're late by about 15 years?" I turned. An elderly man stepped out from the side of the house, a canvas apron tied over his plaid shirt, one hand braced on a cane. "You knew I was coming?" I asked, confused. He gave a nod, then studied me a beat longer. "You're Robert's girl. You've got his eyes." A pause. "He said you might come one day. Told me to keep things in order. Name's Holst. I take care of the place." I introduced myself, still not sure whether I was stepping into a memory or someone else's unfinished story. Holst motioned me toward the greenhouse, which was surprisingly intact inside, plants grown wild but not dead. Trust paid the upkeep, monthly, right until 6 months ago. Then, nothing. No word. No funds. I figured. He trailed off and looked away. Well, I figured wrong. I swallowed hard. "Clarice. That the woman who answered the trust office line last spring?" he asked, and I nodded. He made a disgusted sound. "She told me the property was being reevaluated for future liquidation. Said it was no longer part of active portfolio interests." "She cut off everything," I said, more to myself than him. "She cut off your grandfather's legacy," Holst added quietly. Inside the main house, it smelled like cedar and dust. Old books lined the hallway, and the light fixtures still had incandescent bulbs. Holst moved slowly, deliberately, and led me to a narrow door at the end of a corridor. "The ledger room," he said. He called it that. I unlocked the door with the second key from the Hemingway book. The room was cool, even colder than the rest of the house. Shelves lined 3 walls, filled with labeled journals, files, cardboard boxes, and one leather-bound book with gilded corners. Rowan Holdings, Legacy Projects. I lifted it with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. Inside, page after page of meticulous documentation. My grandfather had started land grant initiatives back in the 60s, college scholarships for underrepresented kids in the state, a local job training program after the mill closures in the early 1980s, medical fund donations, anonymous gifts to libraries. Each initiative was tied to the Rowan Family Trust. And in the back, a note written in my father's familiar hand. "Clarice says she'll streamline everything." That frightens me. I don't think she understands what we're protecting here. Or maybe she does, and wants it gone. There was no anger in his words, only sorrow, a weariness I hadn't recognized in him until now. Holst sat nearby on a wooden stool, watching me turn pages. "He was proud of you, you know. Said you'd find your own way, not through name or title, but through truth." I nodded, unable to speak. Something nudged me then, an itch of instinct. I scanned the old desk in the corner, its drawers tightly shut. The bottom one creaked, resisting me until I yanked hard. A small lockbox lay inside, dusty but intact. It had a keyhole, and the brass key on the second ring slid in perfectly. Inside were 3 things. A photograph, faded but clear. Me, maybe 5 or 6 years old, sitting on my grandfather's lap beside this very cottage. We were laughing, his hands around mine. A letter, folded and notarized. I opened it carefully. "To whom it may concern, the sole beneficiary of the Rowan Family Trust, as outlined in its original 1947 charter and all subsequent revisions until 2012, is Yvain Rowan, biological granddaughter of Harold Rowan. This supersedes any posthumous amendments not co-signed by the founder or approved by the Board of Legacy Trustees." And then, Clarice's undoing fell into place. She hadn't just rerouted wealth. She'd systematically dismantled the very soul of the family trust, its giving arm, its educational foundations, the reason the Rowan name meant anything to anyone in this town. She tried to erase not just my claim to inheritance, but my tie to the very legacy that made this place matter. She cut off Holst, she stripped scholarships, she reclassified the grants as outdated liabilities. She had hoped no one would notice, because no one was left to ask the right questions. Until me. Back on the porch, Holst handed me a faded envelope. He left this with me, told me not to open it, said you'd know when. I opened it on the spot. It was a list. Names, dates, places. Every student, family, or community center ever helped by the Rowan Trust. Thousands of them. I didn't just want justice anymore, I said quietly, fingers curling around the list. I wanted restoration, and I was ready to bring the full truth to light. I didn't just want justice anymore. I wanted restoration, and I was ready to bring the full truth to light. The following days moved quickly. Holst and I worked out of the old ledger room at Rowan Bluff, files spread across every table. The smell of dust and salt water mingled with the weight of the task ahead. We photocopied everything: original grant approvals, canceled checks, legal memos, board letters. I contacted the county archivist, a woman named Sheila, who nearly cried when I showed her what we'd found. "You mean these weren't lost?" she asked, her voice trembling as she sifted through old binders. "They were hidden," I replied. With her help, I tracked down names from the list my grandfather had left. Real people, not lines in a ledger. A retired high school principal named Leonard, who told me the trust helped him build a library in a neighborhood once deemed unworthy of resources. A single mother named Grace, who received housing help after losing her husband to illness. A man named Aaron, once a teenage cancer survivor, who now ran a nonprofit for youth mentorship. Each conversation grounded me. This wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, memory, survival. By the end of the week, we had collected over a dozen testimonies, photographs, and signed affidavits. Holst suggested going to court. I shook my head. I don't want another trial. I want people to remember what this name meant before it became a currency for control. So I made a call, then another, and another. By Thursday, I had a small room booked at the local civic center, a podium, and a half-hour slot with 3 local news outlets. I didn't expect a crowd. I didn't want one. This wasn't about flash. At 10 a.m., I stepped onto the stage in a modest blue dress, the ocean wind blowing in through cracked windows behind me. Holst stood in the back, arms crossed. Sheila sat beside Leonard and Grace in the front row, holding a folder like it was made of glass. The reporters barely looked up at first, until I said, "My name is Yvonne Rowan. I'm here not to accuse, but to remember. My grandfather, Harold Rowan, built something quiet and powerful here, a trust that reached people most systems forgot. And over the last few years, someone tried to erase it all. But legacy doesn't die that easily." I held up the photograph of my grandfather and me in front of the cottage. Then the notarized letter. I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth had its own gravity. I watched as the mood shifted. Cameras turned on, pencils hit notepads. Leonard stepped up to the mic next, his voice steady. Without that grant, our school wouldn't have survived the '89 cuts. Rowan Trust saved not just a building, but generations. Grace spoke next. Then Aaron. Their words weren't polished, they were honest, lived in. That night, the headline read, "Rowan heir revives hidden family legacy, calls for community restoration." Clarissa's name didn't appear once. I didn't need it to. But she must have seen it, because the next morning, her law firm announced her voluntary leave. The local trust oversight board launched a review. Whispers started about fund misappropriation and trust tampering. I received 4 interview requests the same day. I turned them all down. "This isn't about scandal," I told one persistent anchor on the phone. "It's about restoration." Instead, I met with a group of former beneficiaries and quietly re-established the Rowan Legacy Fund. We opened a new office just 3 blocks from the Civic Center. It wasn't large, 3 rooms, 1 conference table, but it felt honest. Alive. By the end of the month, the scholarship program was back. Monthly checks returned to the library, the after-school programs, and even Holst's salary. I updated the records online, linking back to archived photos and letters that Sheila helped digitize. And Clarice's mansion? I had it appraised, then quietly listed. I didn't need a public statement, just a silent redirect. The proceeds from the sale were split, half to seed the new education grants, half to rebuild the regional food pantry my grandfather once funded after a hurricane. I never told Clarice. I didn't need to. Late one evening, as the sun was dropping low over Elder's Bluff, I sat back in the ledger room, leafing through one of the older journals. Between 2 pages, something slipped free, a folded envelope, brittle with age. It was addressed in my father's handwriting. I held it for a long moment before opening it. Yvain, I'm sorry. I didn't protect you from Clarice the way I should have. I let her push you out. I let silence win. But I never stopped loving you. You were always the better part of me. I see you, kiddo. Even now. And I hope, wherever you are, you're still building something bigger than yourself. Dad. The tears came then. Not the bitter kind that sting, but the kind that wash you clean. I didn't wipe them away. I let them fall. Because some truths don't need to be shouted. Some justice doesn't need applause. And some legacies rise not by force, but by returning home to where they were born. There was just one last thing to do before I could finally let go, and it was buried beneath a single marble stone. 2 weeks had passed since the press conference. The weather had shifted to early spring, soft and moody, with a haze that rolled in from the coast like a blanket you didn't ask for but didn't mind. I waited until the weekend before making the trip. There was no ceremony, no calls, no fanfare. I simply drove to the cemetery on the south edge of town. The gate squeaked as I pushed it open. It was older than I remembered, chipped paint, ivy swallowing the brick walls, and rows of stones like sentences cut short. I walked slowly, careful not to disturb the silence. I carried a small wooden box tucked beneath my coat, wrapped in an old linen cloth. It took longer than I expected to find his grave. The map they gave me at the office was vague, and the section he was buried in looked almost forgotten. No manicured grass. Just wild growth and weathered markers that leaned like tired shoulders. When I finally saw it, I stopped. There was no name, just a flat, cracked stone with initials barely visible under moss, RR. The groundskeeper must have heard my steps. He appeared a few feet behind me, holding a rake and wiping sweat from his brow with a red handkerchief. "You looking for Robert Rowan?" he asked. I nodded. He scratched his chin. He was brought in quiet, real quiet. No service, no flowers, no obituary either. Just a woman who paid in cash, signed family, and walked off. I didn't need to ask who. I already knew. My throat tightened. It wasn't the grave that hurt. It was the idea that even in death, Clarice had buried him in silence. Like he didn't deserve to be remembered. Like he didn't matter. I waited until the groundskeeper left before kneeling down. The earth beneath me was soft, still damp from the morning dew. I set the box on the stone, my fingers shaking just a little. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," I said quietly. "I should have come sooner. I should have found you. But I'm here now, and I brought everything back. Your legacy. Your name. Me." I opened the box slowly. Inside was a folded photograph of the two of us from when I was 10, standing in front of Elder's Bluff with garden soil on our hands. There was a copy of the letter he wrote, the one I'd found tucked in the ledger, and the last page from the journal he'd left behind. I placed them gently inside a clear sleeve and laid them on the grave. No one saw. No one needed to. That afternoon, I returned with a granite headstone I'd had made the week before. I hired a local stonemason who didn't ask questions, only promised to finish it by Sunday. He kept his word. The new stone was simple, just enough to say what mattered. Robert Rowan, father, builder of good things. I didn't carve in years or accolades, just the truth. There was no ceremony, no eulogy. I didn't even bring a chair. I stood in silence as the wind rustled through the trees and the clouds shifted like breath. A single white flower, fresh from the garden I'd revived at Elder's Bluff, was placed at the base of the stone. And then I stayed. For a long while. No words, just presence. When I finally walked away, it was quiet. Not empty, not sad. Just quiet. Back at Elder's Bluff, the sun was rising over the cliffs. I'd left the greenhouse windows open that morning, and the scent of rosemary and fresh soil drifted through the kitchen. The kettle hissed softly on the stove. I poured myself a cup of tea and walked to the back porch barefoot, steam curling between my fingers. The mailbox flag was up. I smiled. Inside were 7 envelopes, thin but full of promise. The first round of scholarship checks had been mailed. Each one bore the Rowan Legacy Fund seal. Each one going to a name I knew, a life I believed in. I sat on the porch swing and looked out at the ocean, waves rolling in like chapters. I whispered, not to the wind, but to whatever part of him might still be listening. It's done. Not because I'd won, not because Clarice had lost, but because I'd restored what mattered. I'd remembered what the world tried to forget. Some people shout their victories, others light fireworks. Me? I just stood at a grave and finally felt like he heard me.